The eighth evening. Dark masses of clouds covered the sky, and the moon did not come out at all in my little chamber. I stood more lonely than ever and gazed up into the sky where he should have appeared. My thoughts flew far away up to my great friend, who each evening showed me such lovely pictures and told me stories. What has he not experienced? He has floated above the waters of the deluge and smiled down on Noah's Ark, as now he does on me, and brought the consolation that a new world bloom again. When the children of Israel wept beside the rivers of Babylon, he looked into sorrow through the willows, where they had hung their harps. When Romeo climbed up the balcony, and the kiss of love rose like a cherub thought from the earth, the full moon hung half hidden in the thin air behind the dark cypresses. He has seen the hero at St. Helena looking forth from the lonely cliff toward the ocean, while great thoughts stirred within him. Yes, indeed, what cannot the moon tell? The history of humanity is to him a book of adventures. Tonight I cannot see you, old friend, and cannot sketch any picture in memory of your visit. Then, as I dreamily looked toward the sky, it brightened. There was a beam of light from the moon, but it vanished, and black clouds glided by. Still, it was a greeting, a friendly good night sent to me by the moon. Ninth evening. Again the sky was clear. Several evenings had passed, and the moon was in his first quarter. I again got an idea for a sketch. Listen to what the moon told me. I followed the polar bird and the swimming whale to the eastern coast of Greenland. Bare rocks covered with ice and mist encircled a valley where twining willows and whortleberry bushes were in their fullest blossom, and the fragrant likeness exhaled its sweet perfume. My rays were faint, my face pale as the leaf of a water lily torn from its stem and driven for weeks upon the water. The aurora borealis flamed, its ring was broad, and from it the strange pillars of fire, changing from red to green, shot forth in whirling columns over the whole heavens. The inhabitants here had assembled for a dance and various kinds of merriment, but the splendor of the scene did not excite wonder in their accustomed eyes. Let the souls of the dead play ball with the walrus head, they thought, according to their superstition. They had thought and eye only for the song and dance. A Greenlander without his fur coat stood in the middle of the circle, and, beating on the drum, he began a song about the seal hunt. The chorus responded with "Ea, Ea," and hopped around and around in a circle, dressed in their garments of white fur. Their eyes and head moved strangely, and the whole scene was like a polar bear's ball. Now judgment and sentencing began. Those who had come with a grievance stepped forward, and the injured person chanted forth boldly and mockingly the faults of his opponent in an extemporaneous song, accompanied by the drum beats and dancing. Then the accused replied with equal shrewdness, while all the people laughed, and finally they pronounced sentence. From the mountains came a thunderous sound. The glaciers above had split into pieces, and the huge masses fell in showers of dust. It was a beautiful Greenland summer night. A sick man lay 100 yards away beneath an open tent of skins. There was still life in his warm blood, but he must die, for he believed that, and all the others believed it too. Already his wife was sewing the skin covering tightly around his limbs, so that afterwards she would not have touched the dead body. "Do you want to be buried on the mountain in the firm snow?" she asked him. "I will cover your grave with your kayak and your arrows, and the angakok will dance over it. Or would you rather be buried in the sea?" "In the sea," the sick man whispered, and nodded with a sad smile. "The sea is a pleasant summer pavilion," said his wife. "Thousands of seals play there. The walrus sleeps at your feet, and the hunt is safe and merry." And then his crying children tore the stretched skin away from the window hole so that the dying man could be carried out to sea, to the swelling ocean, which in his life had given him food, and now in death was to give him rest. The floating icebergs passing back and forth by day and night became his tombstone. A seal slumbers on the icebergs while the storm bird flies over them. 10th evening. I once knew an old maid, said the moon. Every winter she wore a coat of yellow satin trimmed with fur, which always seemed new. It was always her only fashion. Every summer she wore the same straw hat and, I believe, the same gray-blue gown. She left her home only to visit an old lady friend who lived across the street. But in later years, even these visits ceased, for the friend was dead. In her solitude, my old maid used to putter about before her window where all summer long a row of pretty flowers stood, and in winter a fine crop of cress grew on the top of a felt hat. During the last month she no longer sat at the window, but I knew she was still alive, for I had not yet seen her set out on that great journey that the old lady and her friend had so often discussed. Yes, she would say, one day when I die, I shall make a longer journey than I have made in my whole lifetime. The family vault is 6 miles from here, and that is where they will carry me, that I may sleep with the rest of my family. Last night, a hearse drove up before the house. A coffin was carried out, and then I knew that she had died. They packed straw and matting around the casket and drove off. Now the quiet old maid, who in the last few years of her life had never left her house, slept quietly, and the hearse rolled swiftly out of town, as if this were a pleasure trip. On the highway it traveled even faster. From time to time the driver looked around nervously. I believe he feared seeing her seated behind him on the coffin in her yellow satin and fur coat. Therefore he lashed the horses recklessly while still holding in the reins as tightly as he could, until the poor horses were covered with foam. The horses were young and high-spirited, and when a hare darted across the road they became unmanageable and ran away. The quiet old maid who year in and year out had only moved about slowly and noiselessly in a circle was now a lifeless corpse, rushed and bumped along the highway over stick and stone. The coffin, which its covering of straw fell off and lay on the road, while horses, hearse and driver dashed wildly off. A lark rose from the field, twittering its morning hymn over the coffin, and then alighted on it, pecking with its beak at the straw mating as if it wanted to pull it to pieces. The lark, singing happily, flew into the air, and I withdrew behind the reddening clouds of dawn. 11th evening. It was a wedding celebration, related the moon. Songs were sung and toasts proposed. Everything was rich and splendid. It was past midnight before the guests departed. The mothers kissed the bride and groom, and they were alone. I saw them through the window, although the curtains were almost drawn. A lamp lighted the cozy room. "Thank heaven they have left," he said, and kissed her hands and lips. She smiled and cried, resting her head on his chest as happily as the lotus flowers rest on the flowing water, and they spoke soft and blissful words. "Sleep sweetly," he exclaimed as she drew the window curtains aside. "How beautifully the moon is shining," she said. "See how quiet and how clear it is." And she put out the lamp. It became dark in the cozy room, but my light then shone as brightly as his eyes shone. Femininity kissed thou the poet's harp when he sings of the mysteries of life. 12th evening. "I shall give you a picture of Pompeii," said the moon. "I was outside the city in the Street of the Tombs, as they call the place where happy youths with wreaths of roses in their heads once danced with the fair sisters of Lais. Now the silence of death reigns there. German soldiers in the service of Naples kept guard and played cards and diced. A group of strangers from beyond the mountains walked into the city, conducted by a guard. They had come to see in the full clear rays of my light the city arisen from the grave. I showed them the ruts of the chariot wheels and the streets paved with great slabs of lava. I showed them the names upon the doors and the signs still hanging before the houses. In the narrow courts they saw the fountain basins ornamented with shells, but the waters no longer spouted forth. No longer were songs heard from the richly painted chambers where the bronze dogs kept watch before the doors. It was the city of the dead. Vesuvius alone still thundered his eternal hymn, and each stanza of it meant call a new eruption. We visited the Temple of Venus, built of pure white marble with its high altar in front of its broad steps. The weeping willow has sprung up between the columns. The air here was transparent and blue, and in the background loomed Vesuvius, black as coal, its flames rising straight as the trunk of a pine tree. The glowing smoke cloud lay in the still calm of the night like the crown of the pine tree, but red as blood. Among the group was a lady singer, a truly great artist. I have seen the honor done her in the first cities of Europe. They approached the amphitheater, and there they all seated themselves on the stone steps. Thus the small space was filled, whereas thousands of years ago the entire place had been. The stage was still there, as in the olden days, with its brick side walls and the two arches in the background, through which the same scenery was visible as in times of old, and nature herself spread out before us the hills between Sorrento and Amalfi. In jest, the lady walked up onto the ancient stage and sang. The place inspired her, and I could not but think of a wild Arabian horse, snorting its mane standing erect as it dashes off in its wild course. Here were the same ease and confidence. I had to think, too, of the suffering mother beneath the cross of Golgotha. So deep was the feeling, the pain expressed. Round about sounded shouts of delight and applause as they had thousands of years before here. What a heavenly gift, they all exclaimed. 3 minutes later the scene was deserted. Everyone was gone, and not a sound was heard, for the group had wandered off, but the ruin stood unchanged, as it will stand for centuries yet to come. The momentary applause is forgotten, as are the singer's notes and smiles, forgotten, gone. Even to me, this hour will be but a fleeting memory. 13th evening. I looked in through the window of a newspaper editor, said the moon. It was somewhere in Germany. It was a handsomely furnished room, with many books and a chaos of newspapers. There were several young men present. The editor himself stood beside his desk. 2 little books, both by unknown authors, were to be reviewed. This one had been sent to me, he said. I haven't read it yet, but it's well put together. What do you think about its contents? Oh, said one of the young men, who was a poet, it is very good. A bit drawn out, but then, good Lord, he's only a young man. It's true the verses might be improved. The thoughts are sound enough. It's only a pity they're so commonplace. But what can you expect? We can't always get something new. You might praise him a little, though in my opinion it's clear he'll never be anything great as a poet. Still, he has read a good deal. He's an excellent Oriental scholar, and he has rather sound judgment. It was he who wrote the splendid review of my reflections on domestic life. After all, we must be lenient toward a young man. But he's a complete ass, said another gentleman in the room. There's nothing worse in poetry than mediocrity, and he certainly will never get any higher. Poor fellow, said a third. And yet his aunt is so proud of him. She's the lady, Mr. Editor, who got together that large list of subscribers for your last volume of translations. Ah, the good woman. Well, I've just given the book a brief notice. Unquestionable talent, a welcome gift, a flower in the garden of poetry, well put together and so forth. But now, about this other book. I suppose the author expects me to buy it. I have heard it praised. The author has genius, they say. Don't you think so? Yes, so they all say, said the poet. But it's rather wild. The punctuation, however, is indicative of genius. It'll do him good to be treated roughly, to be pulled to pieces, otherwise he will have far too good an opinion of himself. But that would be unfair, said a fourth. Let's pick at little faults, but rather find pleasure in what is good. And there is much here worth praising. He writes better than all the rest of them. Heaven help us, if he's such a great genius, he can take sharp criticism. There are enough people to praise him in private. Let us not drive him mad with flattery. decided talent, wrote the editor. The usual carelessness here and there that he can write bad verses may be seen on page 25, where there are 2 hiatuses. We recommend that he study the classics, etc. I passed on, the moon continued, and peeped through the window of the aunt's house. There sat the praised poet, the tame one, receiving homage from all the guests, and he was happy. I sought out the other poet, the wild one. He was in a large gathering at one of his patrons. The subject of conversation was his rival's book. "Some time or other I'll read your poems," said the patron. "But to tell the truth, and you know I always say what I think, I don't expect much from them. In my opinion, you're too wild for me, too fantastic. But I must admit that as a man, you are highly respectable." A young girl sat in a corner reading a book. "In the dust are trodden genius and its glory, while every day talent wins high acclaim. It is, alas, a very old story. It'll never be new, but ever the same." 14th evening. The moon spoke. "Near the forest path are 2 farmhouses. The doors are low and the windows placed irregularly. White thorn bushes and barberry ramble around them. Their mossy roofs are overgrown with yellow flowers and house leek. Only green cabbage and potatoes grow in the little garden. But by the hedge grows a willow tree, and beneath it sat a little girl, her eyes fixed on the old oak tree between the farmhouses. Its tall and withered trunk had been sawed off the top, and upon it a stork had built his nest. He stood above it now, rattling his bill. A little boy came out and stood beside the girl. They were brother and sister. "What are you looking at?" he asked. "At the stork," she said. "The neighbor woman told me he'll bring us a little brother or sister tonight, and I'm watching so I can see when it comes." "The stork doesn't bring anything," said the boy. "The neighbor woman, I believe me, told me that too, but she laughed when she said it, so I asked her if she dared say 'on my honor.' No, she didn't dare do that. I know perfectly well that what they say about the stork is only a story they tell to children." "But then where did the baby come from?" asked the girl. "Our Lord brings it," said the boy. "God has it under his mantle, but no one can see God, so we can't see him bring it." Just then a breeze stirred in the branches of the willow tree. The children folded their hands and looked at each other. Surely this was God who had brought the little baby. And they clasped each other's hands. The door of the house opened, and the neighbor woman appeared. "Come in now," she said, "and see what the stork has brought you. It is a little brother." And the children nodded, for they already knew the baby had come. 15th evening. I sailed over Lüneburg Heath, the moon said. A lonely hut stood there by the roadside. Around it grew a few weathered bushes where a nightingale, which had lost its way, was singing. It would surely die during that cold night. It was swan's song that I heard. Morning dawned, and along came a group of immigrant peasant families who wanted to go to the Bremen or Hamburg to take a ship for America, where they hoped to see their dreams of good fortune come true. The youngest children were carried on the backs of the women, while the bigger ones skipped along beside them. A wretched horse was dragging a cart that bore the few household effects they possessed. The cold wind blew, causing a little girl to nestle more closely to her mother, who looked up at my round, decreasing orb and thought of the cruel hardships that she had suffered in her home, of the heavy taxes they had not been able to pay. Her thoughts were those of the whole group, hence the rosy glimmer of the rising dawn seemed to them like a ray of promise, a forerunner of the sun of happiness that would rise again. They heard the song of the dying nightingale, and to them it seemed no false prophet, but the herald of good fortune. The wind whistled, but they could not understand its song. "Sail over the ocean," you have said, "for the long passage with all your possessions. Poor and helpless shall you set foot on the promised land. You may sell yourselves, your wives, and your children, yet you shall not suffer long, for behind the broad, fragrant leaf it sits on the angel of death. Her welcome kiss breathes the deadly fever into your blood. Sail on over the swelling waves." And the group listened happily to the song of the nightingale, for it surely seemed to promise good fortune. The day broke through the light clouds. The peasants were crossing the heath on their way to church. In their black gowns and with the strip of white linen bound closely around their heads, the women looked as if they stepped out of the old paintings in the church. Around them lay a vast dead scene, the withered brown heath, dark scorched plains between the white sand dunes. The women were carrying their prayer books as they made their way to the church. Oh, pray, pray for those who go forth to their graves beyond the swelling waves.